It's nice to see some familiar faces. I'm going to just start off with setting the stage about what it is that I'm really going to talk about, because it's kind of a big topic, citizen ID projects. When I talk about, there's a couple things. In any credential issuance programs, you have multiple phases. And I'm going to break them down into a couple, and primarily issuance versus usage. And the idea is that you have to set up certain rules upon establishing any program for creating IDs or credentials. And that's planning for issuance. And a lot of work tends to go into that process to make sure that you're defining the proper policy, putting together the policy background, card manufacturers, enrollment processes for establishing a level of trust in the program that you're creating. An old IT term that I think we're all familiar with, garbage in, garbage out. So the idea around defining policy is to make sure that you've got clean data coming into your system so that as you move into actual issuance and usage, you've established something that you don't have to look over your shoulder and wonder, is this still working right? You create good policy on the front end, and that means that you've got a program that you can build upon. So that's actually not what I'm here to talk about, but I wanted to get that point out in front because it really is critical to any program. Another clarification of terms is authentication versus validation. These are two terms that are often used interchangeably, and I won't argue over what the proper usage is, but for the context of what I'm going to talk about today, authentication is the process of binding someone to that identity that they use, whether that's a digital certificate or some other form of identification. That's the three things, right? Something you have, something you know, something unique to you. So something you have might be the smart card, something you know, your PIN or passcode. And of course, something unique to you is typically a biometric. And that's the form of authenticating yourself to whatever credential or identity that you're using to establish that you are who you say you are. Validation is the process of getting the answer of whether that credential is still trusted by the issuer who provided it to that individual in the first place. So we're here to answer two questions. Is this person who they say they are? And can I trust them right now for the operation they're about to perform? So that validation is what we focus on. Can I trust this credential at this very moment in time that it's being used? Pardon the old comic. This has been around for an awfully long time. But because we're talking about internet-based activity, the point is we really don't know who we're talking to on the other end. And I lifted this comic from the New Yorker, and you can see it's many years old, 1993. But this idea still holds true today. Do we know who the person is on the other end? Can I trust who this is? You know, on the internet, nobody knows that you're John or whether you're a dog for that matter. So I love that comic. The other thing about the internet is that it's an awfully big place out there. Again, I lifted a couple diagrams off the internet just to demonstrate that we're dealing with what some people like to call the wild, wild west. You have no idea who's out there on the internet, whether they're snooping, listening, looking, or coming at your infrastructure or trying to crack the important things that you've built. So again, establishing an identity is critically important. And the key points of that identity when it's used is we have to validate it every time. And the purpose of that is, if I don't, what's the point of establishing a strong identity for use over the internet? If I just create something and say, okay, now use this, it's kind of the equivalent of creating flash passes that we've seen for years. Here, this is me. Trust me. I'm telling you it's me. The idea of validation is, at the time that credential is used, I can get an answer from the source that issued that identity to tell me that this person is who they say they are, and they can do what they're trying to do right now. Those answers have to come from a trustworthy source, and these are the critical tenets of validation, right? It's got to come from a source that we know we can trust. It has to work with the applications that we're going to deploy for using that identity. regardless of what it is, web-based, server-based, etc., the credential has to work with those applications that I'm deploying. Third, it's got to be reliable. Again, the internet being the wild, wild west, we can't always rely on every single connection to work all the time under optimal conditions. The reality is it doesn't. No one's in charge of the internet, and therefore sometimes things don't go as they exactly as we would hope they would. Last, the user experience always has to be fast, because the end user, they don't really care about credentials or PKI or validation or authentication. They have a job they have to do. They have a transaction they're trying to conduct. All they want to do is get onto the internet, do what they have to do, and proceed on with their day. So we have to make sure that whatever we implement for these individuals doesn't create any delays or time lags that effectively make them say, this thing doesn't work. Now, if we think about validation in kind of a historical context, I'm going to age myself here a little bit, but I remember when I used to go to the store and I'd take out my credit card. And what did they do? They'd take that credit card and they'd open this little book, and they'd go through the book to see if my credit card was still good. So you have to distribute those books, and you have to look through those books. But ultimately, that's how they validated credit cards in the old days. And credentials are much the same way. We have to validate them against something. So I'm just curious, how many people remember going and carrying their credit card and actually having them whip out the little books? No one's going to admit it. Nice. Okay, I'm old enough to remember it. The electronic version of that is what they call certificate revocation lists. And effectively, this is an electronic version of distributing that credit card booklet to whomever asks for it. It's actually even less trustworthy than the old credit card booklet, because those credit card booklets were printed by MasterCard or Visa or whomever the credit card company was, and sent to the sources that they know should receive it. Electronic validation, however, is quite the opposite. Anyone can ask for the status of a credential. The provider of those answers isn't really looking at who's asking, because that process doesn't really work. They don't know who's going to be asking tomorrow. If I'm using that digital identity to, say, sign an email so that it can be trusted by the recipient, the provider of that digital identity has no idea who I'm going to send email tomorrow, and therefore they have to make sure that that environment is always open to anyone. And we all know the dangers of that. That's the whole point of the internet being the wild, wild west. Now I've created an infrastructure with my most trustworthy information